Hello, you're welcome to another exciting edition of this Bible study program. My name is Osamagbe Leslie Igariba, and I'm a gospel preacher in the Church of Christ. Today, I have my brother and friend, Handy Soccer, here with me from Kentucky, United States. He's a gospel preacher and he's an author, he's an editor, he's a writer. He does a lot of things with regards to the gospel of Christ. And for those who have been following this program, you know him already. He's not a visitor on this show. And it's been a while I've had him here. One brother from Ogun State, Brother Femi Okunsanya, actually has been disturbing me to bring him on this show to discuss this very topic that we're going to be talking about. So, Brother Handy, you're welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I was glad to finally be back. It has been a while, but I'm happy to be here today. Happy to talk to you, and hopefully we can help on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for honoring the invitation. I'm very happy, and I'm sure my friend and brother Femi Okusaya would be happy as well because he's been telling me that this very topic we want to talk about, that actually he was particular about you, that you should be the one to come up to handle it, and that he likes the way you analyze, topics that you've handled. So, by way of introduction, I would like to tell the audience what we are actually going to talk about before you actually pick up. Now, a church in Nigeria actually engaged a preacher, and then they sent the preacher an appointment letter for the work of a preacher. I don't want to mention the church name, not because I'm afraid of them, but I just want to give them the respect of, keeping them anonymous. I'm not also going to mention the preacher's name, but I have the letter with me. The congregation wrote the letter, an appointment letter as a preacher sent to the preacher of the congregation to resume work. However, there are a couple of things in the letter that are, we want to consider. So I'll be reading out those things, and then you'll be telling us the scriptural position of, maybe what the church did or as written in the letter is actually correct. So there are a lot of things. So that's what we want to talk about in this discussion. So one of the things in the letter, by way of, I want you to begin with this, is that the preacher is considered as an employee of the congregation. And so it is stated in the letter that he has to be subject to the church leaders. The congregation in question has no elders and deacons. They have not been scripturally organized by way of ordaining elders. They don't have elders. But they specifically stated in the letter that the preacher must be subject to the church leaders and must, report to the church leaders, whenever he's going to be missing services or maybe whatever he wants to do, basically, the church leaders are placed above the preacher, and then he's going to be responsible to them. So the two questions you're going to be beginning with is, first of all, is the preacher an employee? Would you consider the preacher as an employee of the congregation that he's working with? And two, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen anything like church leaders in the scripture apart from elders. So what do you think they mean by church leaders in the absence of elders and deacons that the preacher must be subject to? Can you take those two questions real quick? Thank you.
Yeah. To start with that first one about whether a preacher is an employee of the church, we need to be very careful because that type of language is not used anywhere in the New Testament. That the preacher is not described as an employee of a church as if the church was a secular business or something like that. That's not the type of arrangement that's described in the scriptures. There is one passage that I wanted to point out. It's 2 Timothy chapter 2, where Timothy was a preacher of the gospel, and Paul was writing to Timothy. And he described him in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24 by saying, "The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged." So he's described here not as an employee of the church, but as a bondservant of the Lord, that he is the Lord's servant. He is the one who is serving him. And earlier in that chapter, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he describes the preacher, the gospel preacher, as a soldier. Verse 3, "Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus." So he's subject to him. He's serving Christ. And the next verse, it says, "No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier." So he's talking about, as he's writing to Timothy, he's saying, you are the bondservant of Christ. You are a soldier for the Lord. And so you are to conduct yourself in a way that ultimately is pleasing to Christ. So he's first and foremost subject to Christ. So the preacher is a servant of the Lord. Now, sometimes brethren have a concept of the church or the preacher being an employee of the church because the preacher might receive wages for preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
And the scriptures talk about that. Second Corinthians 11, verse 8, Paul talked about how he took wages from other churches to serve them. And 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 14, that the Lord directed those who preach the gospel to get their living from the gospel. So because of passages like that, some brethren have a misconception that that makes the preacher an employee of the church. But rather, what's going on there when a preacher is receiving support like that is that the congregation then is working with him. Third John in verse 8 actually calls them fellow workers with the truth when we support brethren who are preaching like that. So the preacher is not an employee of the church in the sense that someone who is working for some business or has an employer or a manager that he's working for him. It's not the same type of relationship. He is doing the work of the Lord, and the congregation, even if they are supporting them or supporting that preacher financially, they are simply working with him in that and supporting him in that work. Now, the other part of that question, when you were bringing this up, where you're asking about church leaders, and you mentioned this particular congregation did not have elders or deacons or anything like that. But when we think about the church leaders or what the New Testament describes, obviously we had in the first century, there were apostles who exercised some type of leadership in the church because they were specifically chosen by Christ. But they had certain qualifications to meet, mainly being witnesses of Christ. So they are not apostles today. So we can discount that as being a possibility as far as leadership in the church. The New Testament describes elders overseeing a congregation. The elders are the leadership in the church, that they are shepherding over the church. First Peter 5 talks about the elders being the shepherds of the congregation. They are overseeing the congregation. So when we think about church leaders, the New Testament talks about elders, and so there aren't others who are authorized to do that work. But you do have other individuals, or at least one other individual that's mentioned in the New Testament as being a sort of church leader. And he's found over in 3rd John and verses 9 and 10, but he's not talked about in a way that is commendable or something that we should emulate his character, because he's a man named Diotrephes.
Okay.
And Diotrephes was one that he could claim to be a leader in the church. But notice what John said about him in 3rd John verses 9 and 10. It says, I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, or some translations say loves to have the preeminence, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words. And not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brethren either, and he forbids those who desire to do so and puts them out of the church. That you have, sadly, in different places, in different churches, that you have individuals like Diotrephes who insist that it's going to be my way and this is how it's going to be done and I'm going to rule the church. He's not an elder, but he is the one who is basically running the church. And if everyone goes along with it, then generally that church can enjoy peace because they just follow what he says. But if anyone ever pushes back against that or questions whether he really has authority, whether he's a church leader in the New Testament sense, then he causes trouble. And that's what Diotrephes was doing. And John says that, well, if I come, I'm going to call attention to his deeds because he's not accepting what the apostles are teaching. He is putting out those or withdrawing from or disfellowshipping those who are trying to follow what the apostles taught, because that is a threat to his position that he has acquired for himself or taken for himself. So there are churches that have a figure like Diotrephes in them that is described like that in the New Testament, but obviously not in a way that is commendable, not in a way that's authorized, that is not the pattern to have one man that he's going to be in charge, he's going to be running everything, and we just have to submit to whatever he says. There's not even, when we think about the eldership, that is the the God's plan for the local church. You still don't have one elder who's over everything. It's a plurality of elders in the local church. So the pattern that we find in the New Testament is that you have elders in the local church. And anytime you have someone else try to take that position, that leadership position, you run into problems like John talked about with Diotrephes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your responses to those two questions. And while you made reference to Diotrephes, something came to my mind because I have a very good understanding of the conversation and the back and forth between this very preacher and the congregation after the letter was sent. The preacher replied, the congregation, officially, the congregation never responded to the letter. Rather, the congregation called the preacher to come in person to have a one-on-one conversation. They were avoiding a written response. And so the preacher had no problem going there. And then the preacher requested, okay, when I come, can you give me an opportunity to teach the congregation on the work of the gospel preacher? The individual that was corresponding with the preacher on the phone declined and said, no, you can't teach us that. We know that already. Okay, the preacher requested then, okay, can you give me an opportunity? Who am I coming to see when I come for the discussion? They said, you're coming to see the church leaders. Okay, who are these church leaders? He said, just some men in the congregation. Okay, can I see the whole man after the worship? They said, no, you just have to see these few people. And so the preacher declined and said, if I'm not going to see everybody, then there's no point of me coming. And that was the end of the whole back and forth. Now that sounds to me more like a Trophy kind of setting, because why would you prevent the person you are bringing into your congregation to do the work of a preacher from seeing the whole man and then wanting him to see maybe a few 4 or 5%? So I think that might be the case in that congregation. A few persons who have actually arrogated the power, like the Diotrephes we read off, and then trying to control the congregation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it sounds like in that type of what you're describing there, it sounds like you don't have maybe necessarily one person who's a Diotrephes. You might have several people
Mm,
are who have set themselves up, or it could be a Diotrephes figure and then a few people who are supporting him. But in either case, there are several people involved there. But in the absence of elders in the local church,
mm-hmm,
that any decisions that are made by the congregation or on behalf of the congregation need to be made as a mutual agreement between them. Elders are overseeing the local flock, so they make decisions for that church. But when there aren't elders, then the only thing we have to fall back to is that this New Testament describes the men being in a sharing a leadership position in a sense, because we know from 1 Timothy chapter 2 that the women are not to usurp authority and do all of that. So
mm-hmm,
so in that type of case, and I've been in churches, sadly, a lot of churches don't have elders like the pattern is, because there aren't qualified men to serve as elders. But when you don't have elders, decisions can't be made by just a handful of the men and say, well, we're just going to make these decisions. That the congregation, particularly the all of the men of the congregation, need to be involved in that. And it's a warning sign there that
mm,
if a congregation or really the leader or the few men who claim to be the leaders of the church, if they invite someone to preach, and especially invite someone to, we want you to come and work with us to preach, but
mm-hmm,
we don't want you to preach on this, whether it's the work of the gospel preacher or anything else. That's that's a red flag that there's something that is not right about that church. And you wonder, like, why would they invite the preacher anyway? If we don't think we're going to like what you say or agree
mm,
with what you say, why are you inviting the preacher anyway? But any decisions like that, they have to be made by mutual agreement, and it can't be just, well, a handful of the men of the congregation, but not all of them, or just one man, like in the case of Diotrephes. It's That's not the what we see shown to us as being authorized in the New Testament. That you want to have elders, you want to have qualified men serving as elders, but when you don't have that, you have to have the rest of the men of or all of the men of the congregation involved, and so that way there can be an agreement there. in whatever work the church is going to do.
All right, thank you very much. Because of time, I would like us to go back to the letter. Um, One of the things mentioned in the letter, remember it's an appointment letter, and then in the appointment letter, the duties and responsibilities of the preacher in the local church is actually listed. So one of the things that was listed is that part of his functions as a gospel preacher in that congregation would be to organize and coordinate the youth of the church in all spiritual and social programs of the congregation. So my question to them and to you is, what passage of the scriptures would you think includes social programs as part of the work of a gospel preacher in the congregation? Very quickly.
Well, that's as far as the work of social programs is the work of the gospel preacher. I would question whether that's even the work of the church at all, let alone the gospel preacher.
Okay.
That you have the New Testament describes the work of the church. The church in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15 is the pillar and support of the truth. And that's the function of the congregation. And the congregation is coming together. Ephesians 4 talks about the whole body fitted, held together, that causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love, that the church is designed to proclaim the gospel and to strengthen and build up the members who are in that congregation. Now, social programs or social events or things like that, there's not necessarily anything wrong with those per se. I could invite people over to my home and have a social event and do all of that, but that doesn't mean that the church is to be involved in that work. That's something that is separate. So I would back up before saying, well, is this the work of the preacher to do this? I would question, is that the work of the church
Church.
to do this? And any member of the church or any Christian can invite people over their homes or do things like that, whether it's the preacher or an elder or any of the members of the church, anyone can do that. But the church, Paul made very clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when he was writing to them about the problems involving the Lord's Supper, he said, you come together to observe the Lord's Supper. You come together for that. But if anyone's hungry, you eat at home. You don't do that when you come together in the local church and as the church. That's something that is different, something that's good. You eat, and you can even eat together, but it's not something that's part of the function of the church. So I would I would not just say that, well, it's not the work of the preacher to do that as
Mhm.
as the as being one who's supported by the church or working with the church. I would say that it's even not the role of the church to be hosting or organizing those things,
Mm.
that we as individuals, we can do that. But the church is focused on preaching the gospel and building up the members, and any social programs or other activities, that's something that is in the realm of us as individuals or families, that we can do that.
All right, thank you very much for that social programs. I remember the last video interview I had with you. We were talking about who is a gospel preacher and what it makes a man a gospel preacher and his work. I remember you took time to explain, the work of a gospel preacher, what makes a gospel preacher, and various terms that the Bible use in describing a preacher. I noticed you didn't mention anything like gospel preacher and all. So I like social programs, I beg your pardon, as part of what the preacher is expected to do. All of his works revolve around preaching the gospel, edifying the brethren. And like you said, I like the part that you said you're going to even question whether this is the work of the church, even before talking about the work of the gospel preacher. So I think that point is noted. The preacher responded in his letter and asked the congregation, what is this part of the work of the preacher? And then there was no response, like I said. I'm hoping that the brethren in this congregation will watch this video and then they would actually consider this, and that's why I'm actually wanting to do this, so that they can actually get to see. Now let's move to another point in the letter. There's a lot of things in the letter, and if we want to pick all of them one after the other, we may not end it, but there are some salient ones that we want to talk about. Now, in Nigerian congregations, at least as I have been to a lot of congregations right from when I was growing up, there is a common thing, which I'm not exactly sure if we have in US churches, is the secretary. The secretary is more like the mini preacher in quotes. And what do I mean? Most of the work in the congregation, such as the writing, the announcement and all of that in most congregations that I've been to is actually done by the secretary. So a lot of people, probably a lot of secretaries have arrogated certain powers to themselves. When the preacher is not there, the next person is the secretary. That's how it's done. But the question in this letter, appointment letter, um, there was an issue about who is to distribute the work uh, um, when the preacher comes into the congregation. Like, of course, there are no elders, so you've got someone to say, well, Brother John, you're going to take this sermon, Brother Luke, you're going to take the Lord's Supper and all of that, things like that. So I've heard of cases in Nigeria where a preacher was fired, in quotes, of course, when they think they employed him, they could fire him, was fired because the secretary of the congregation, and of course the congregation, believes that it is the responsibility of the secretary to share responsibility. The preacher says, no, it is my responsibility to do this because I am the gospel preacher. I know the individuals to use. And then the congregation says, no, the secretary. And then I am telling you a life story. The preacher was fired. On two occasions, I've heard similar stories where there was a loggerhead between the preacher and the congregation because they wanted the secretary to do the sharing of the work. And then the preacher says, no, I've got to do this. Now, this issue came up during this back and forth between this preacher and the congregation. And then the congregation refused to open up and say, well, it is your responsibility as a preacher to do this. And then the preacher was seeking, okay, whose responsibility is this? So what do you think is the right thing? Who should do that? Should the secretary, a member of the congregation, identify members and set up members to handle these activities, or do you think the preacher should do that?
Well, a couple things on that. First thing is that when you talked about the secretary, that it's a little bit different than some churches here have, what they call a secretary, but it's a little bit different role than what you described there.
Mm.
I would, what you have described as what the secretary there, I would think that it's a little bit dangerous to kind of have someone in a position like that, because it almost seems like they have taken on authority for themselves that they don't have. That we've talked about already, that elders are overseeing the congregation. In the absence of elders, that you don't have one person say, well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to set everything up and I'm going to do all this. Anything that's done in the absence of elders has to be done by mutual agreement by the congregation. And
Mm.
so that's the way it has to be done. So I would be hesitant of saying that, well, we can just have the secretary that he's going to run things because we don't have a preacher or because we don't have elders. I would be hesitant to say that's how we need to operate this, because again, that it opens the door to someone like Diotrephes, who
Right.
is just going to, whatever I want to do, that's what we're going to do. Now, as far as whose responsibility is to decide who's going to lead a prayer, who's going to lead singing, and who's going to do things like that, I don't know that there's really a New Testament passage that I can think of that specifies who exactly has that responsibility. Now, in the congregation where I preach, I make the schedule like that. I put the schedule up as far as who's going to lead the prayer and who's going to officiate the Lord's table, who's going to lead singing. I do that, but I don't do that because I'm a preacher. I just volunteered to do that, and that I can do that. I think any of the men of the congregation can do that, but what we need to be careful of is thinking that, well, because someone's doing that, then they're in a position of authority or a position of leadership. Anything, whether there's a preacher or no preacher, whoever's making the decision on who's going to lead in worship services, to lead singing or to word prayers or things like, or officiate the Lord's table, or who's going to get up and teach, those decisions, as far as who is able to do that, again, have to be made by mutual agreement by the congregation. That, as I said, the congregation where I preach, I make that schedule. But if we're going to, add someone to say, well, we're going to have this person, start leading prayers, or we're going to have this person start leading singing, I don't make that decision unilaterally. I talk to the men of the congregation and say that, well, I think this brother here is able to do that. He's told me that he's willing to serve in this role. And I talk to the brethren before I put them on the schedule. So I don't believe that I have authority to decide without the congregation's input, this person's going to do this, this person's going to do that. So as far as who makes the schedule, I don't know that the New Testament specifies who it has to be. I think it can be the preacher. I think it can be a member of the congregation, but I think we need to be careful that we don't have one person in the congregation elevated to the point that we think he is the one in authority, and then no one else is then involved, and everyone just follows whatever that person does. Whoever's leading, that has to be done because the congregation is in agreement that yes, this person can serve in this role, this person can do this, and then whoever makes the schedule, then they're going to make the schedule. But that's, at least from my understanding, I don't see where it is a specific person's, whether preacher or otherwise, where we can say it's this person's role and then no one else can do it. I think it could be done by anyone, but it has to be done by agreement among the congregation.
All right, thank you. A good response. A follow up on that. You know, like in the case of the diatrophy thing, we've got, like the way I described the secretary in most conservative congregations that I know, they don't have secretary. Like you won't hear that term secretary in the church at all because they don't see that as a scriptural um, position that you should even hear at all. Uh, some congregations even have some people, oh, maybe we've got business meeting today. Well, you can do the writing of the meeting minutes today, and someone else do that some other time. So, but in most other congregations, you've got to see the secretary, and whenever letters are written, you must of course see the secretary. But all right, sorry for the break. We're talking about the church secretary thing. The problem with this thing is that sometimes, it end up becoming that the secretary decides when the preacher mounts the pulpit. You have a secretary. I've heard of a congregation, this same congregation, I've heard of, things like, they are with a former preacher, you know, it would be there is more like the congregation is now like a puppet, like they tell him when to go and preach, when to mount the pulpit, and all of that. But when you look at Titus, for instance, when Paul was talking to Titus, he said, I've set you in Crete to set in order the things that are lacking and ordain elders in every church. So that's where some individuals are seeing it, that the preacher, you know, is one of his responsibilities is to set in order the congregation. And in setting in order the congregation, you should be able to identify men who would be able to, do this. But I agree with you that, I mean, it's not a unilateral, authority or position that somebody has to say, well, it must be done this way. So in that case, I wouldn't agree with the congregations who would say the secretary must be the one to handle that. That's just what I've got to say on that.
Yeah, and on that point on with Paul telling Titus, set in order the things that
Yeah,
remain, he was specifically talking about, setting up elders in those
right,
churches.
right.
So really, when you have a preacher come and work with a congregation, that's one of the things that he's trying to do. If there are men who are qualified, or if there are men who are close to being qualified, and he's going to try to help them in order to get along to where they need to be, then that's what his responsibility is. So he definitely is trying to set the congregation in order to fix what is lacking, which means there's not elders. He's trying to get elders in place. So he's definitely going to do that. I don't know necessarily that means that he's going to say, well, this person's going to lead prayer, or this person's going to lead singing. He can do that. Like I said,
Mm,
with the congregation that I'm with, I do make the schedule, and I put that down. But again, that's with the mutual agreement with the brethren there,
mm.
that I'm not making decisions, against what anyone else thinks, that we're still agreeing on who is going to be leading singing, who's going to be leading prayers. But it's just that on a particular, any given Sunday, I would just put the schedule together as far as who's going to be doing that week. You're right with Titus that he was to set those things in order. I think that's primarily focused on putting up elders there. But with the secretary, that having that person in place, or that really he's not really put in place, he kind of takes that place for himself. That's something that is completely different from what we're talking about. That's him taking authority that he is not given anywhere in the New Testament.
All right, thank you very much. You've got like 5 more minutes, so I would like us to talk about these two questions before it times out. Now, one of the things in the letter is that the preacher was placed on a 6 month probationary period of appointment, and after which, is going to be confirmed as the preacher. What do you say about that?
Well, it's a little confusing to me to think about a congregation, giving a preacher a probationary period. I can't think of a good reason why a church would do this. Now, we know that, anytime a church invites a preacher to work with them and a preacher goes to work with that church, that work is being done by mutual agreement, that the church wants the preacher to work with them, and the preacher is of his free will. He's going to go work with that church. And then that work ends whenever the church no longer, wants the preacher working with them, or the preacher no longer wants to be there. That work's going to end. So no one believes that I've ever heard of that a preacher goes to a congregation and then he is permanently there as the preacher, and that he's never, never going to leave or never going to go somewhere else. That no one thinks that. So this idea of a probationary period, that the church is going to invite a preacher, but they're not sure if they want the preacher to work with them, that I don't understand why you would do that. When you invite a preacher to come work with you, you're involved in fellowship with him and whatever support, financial support you give him, but also the church is working with him. The preacher's not there just to do whatever, work you think he's supposed to do, and the congregation sits around and does nothing. You are working with the preacher. And so you have fellowship with one another. And if a church says, well, we're going to give him a probationary period because we don't know that we want him to preach for us, well, why are you inviting him in the first place? And another thing on this, that if you have a preacher who is working with a particular congregation already, and you're going to invite him over to work with you, he is having to make the choice to stop working with that one congregation. So you're causing him to stop working with those brethren to come over to work with you when you're not even sure if you want him to work with you. So I don't understand that this concept of a probationary period. It sounds like it's pulled from the business world and not the New Testament, that we're going to operate the church like a business. And so the preacher, he's going to be an employee, and we're going to try him out, see if he's going to work out for 6 months. And then if that doesn't work out, we'll just let him go and then find another employee in his place. That's what the business world does. That's not what we read about in the New Testament as far as preachers and churches working together.
All right, thank you very much, Brother Andy, for that response. I appreciate that. Probationary period is very common here among most churches. Again, mostly liberal. Uh, um, like you said, I don't see reasons why people do that. I have one more question, but I'm not sure we have time to take that. This is Brother Andy Soccer talking to us. He's from the Church of Christ in Kentucky, and one of the congregations in Kentucky. Kentucky is big, so so that's where he's talking to us from, and he's been a regular guest here. And I thank you so much for coming to handle this topic and doing justice to the questions that have been asked. I hope and pray that the congregation would see this and probably make a change so that they can actually get a sound preacher. But the final response of the preacher to them is that he's praying for them, that they should get a faithful, sound preacher and not a houseboy, as the appointment letter seems to suggest. So hopefully they don't get a houseboy and they get a preacher. They're looking for a houseboy, actually, not a gospel preacher, based on the appointment letter. That's what I think they are looking for. And so we'll end it here at this time because we don't have much time to go. But the major thing in the letter has been addressed. I thank Brother Femi again for telling me to hold this interview and for suggesting that I bring Brother Handy. Thank you. Well, do you have a closing speech for us in the next 10 or 15 seconds?
Probably not in the next 10 or 15 seconds, but I appreciate the discussion, and hopefully we did some good for the people who are listening.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. And have a nice time until I see you again. Remain blessed.